sessions. So our next session is, the topic is floodplain restoration as a stream management strategy in the agricultural Midwest. Sarah Roley will be giving that presentation, and Sarah received her PhD in biology from the University of Notre Dame in 2013. She is currently a research associate at Kellogg Biological Station at Michigan State University, and her research focuses on nutrient cycling in human-dominated landscapes with a focus on remedies for nutrient pollution. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi everyone, and thanks for that introduction, Roz, and thanks for alerting me to this conference so I could come and present. I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-authors. I'm going to be presenting a synthesis of a lot of research we've been doing for the last 7 or 8 years, and each one of the co-authors has led up one of the projects that I'll be talking about. So if you spent any time in the agricultural Midwest, which you probably have since you're at this conference, you have seen a stream that looks like the one on the left. That, of course, is not what streams look like unless they've had a lot of human intervention. So it's very straight, it's very deep relative to its width, it doesn't have any floodplains. And a lot of these streams look like that because they're part of an extensive drainage network that is designed to help farming occur in this region. So you have great soils for farming, but they tend to be waterlogged. It's very flat. They're often not well drained. And so in order to keep the root zone aerated, in order to be able to physically get in the field, we have drained an enormous amount of this landscape. And so traditional stream restoration, where we're adding in meanders and doing sort of a whole-scale restoration, is probably not feasible in this region. But we're looking at if we could possibly restore some ecosystem services to these streams simply through adding floodplains. So through a simple geomorphological change, can we get some ecosystem services back into these streams? And what we're looking at is something that's called the two-stage ditch. This was developed by some engineers at Ohio State University. And basically, they just add floodplains to a trapezoidal drainage ditch. And the idea behind this originally was that these ditches are not very stable. So during high flows, there's a tremendous amount of shear stress on those banks. They tend to slump and fill with sediment, and then they have to be dredged out every few years, which is costly. And so they thought, well, what if we added some floodplains and make these ditches a little bit more stable? They won't be as expensive to maintain. So it's pretty simple. The main channel is left intact, and then there's a floodplain excavated on either side of the main channel. Each of those floodplains is the same width as the main channel or a little wider. And so during high flows, the water flows out onto those floodplains, the velocity slows down, shear stress slows down, and you have greater stability. So these engineers have been studying this process for 10 years or so, and they're pretty confident that this is a more stable design. We were looking at ecosystem services, and the things that we were looking at include denitrification. So this is a process by which nitrate dissolved in the water column gets converted to nitrogenous gases via microbes that live in the sediments. So this happens in the presence of organic carbon and under anoxic conditions. And this is a permanent nitrogen removal. So dissolved nitrogen turned into a gas out of the system. And the reason we thought that this might be enhanced in these ditches is simply because we have greater surface area. So now during high flows, that water is interacting with a greater surface area of sediment. It's also slowing down. So we've increased the time and space over which denitrification can occur. Another process is just a physical process. It's the particles settling out. We've got lower velocity, so we expect particles to settle. So retaining some of those excess sediments and also phosphorus potentially associated with those sediments. And then another process we're looking at is assimilatory uptake. So that's just microbes, plants, algae, organisms taking up nitrogen and phosphorus and incorporating it into their body tissues. The mechanism we hypothesized is that we've decreased the turbidity, so maybe we've now increased photosynthesis and increased assimilatory uptake. And in case you need to be convinced that excess nitrogen is a problem, I just have a couple of examples up here, one local to Iowa and one on a more continental scale. So in Iowa, Des Moines is suing some upstream counties for their high drinking water treatment costs. There's so much nitrate in the water they have to spend quite a bit of resources to treat that water. And then on the right, or the left, I have the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. We've got, every year we have a huge zone of the Gulf of Mexico that is lacking oxygen because of all the excess nitrogen coming from these agricultural systems. So we had 8 study sites across Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. All of these sites are at least 70% row crop agriculture in the watershed. They all have a history of conventional maintenance, so that means that they've been kept in that trapezoidal shape for several decades. They also all have abundant nutrients, although there's quite a range. So they're all elevated relative to a reference stream, but there is a range from sort of really, really high versus just sort of high nutrients. I'm just going to point out one site. This first site up here is Shatto Ditch. That's where we've done the most extensive work and the most detailed work. So I'll be presenting a lot of results from this ditch. And then the other sites are really to see if the patterns that we saw at this first ditch were present across this region. And these are just a couple of photos of these other ditches as they look after they've been vegetated. The one on the top is immediately after construction. And this is what they look like when they're flooded. You can sort of see the original channel by the tussocks of grass on either side. We had the misfortune of having a really large flood event about 2 months after we constructed the channel. But to our delight, the channel stayed intact. So there's no vegetation on the benches on those floodplains yet. We have a little bit of coconut blanket to sort of keep soils in place, and we sort of expected the whole thing would wash away. In fact, it didn't. So that gave us confidence that was indeed a stable design. All right, so this first figure is looking at the seasonal denitrification rates at Shatto Ditch, so the first ditch we were studying. And there's just sort of 2 points I want to make with this figure. The first one is that we see seasonal variation in denitrification rates. That's not unexpected. That's mostly related to the stream nitrate concentration. So the higher the nitrate, usually the higher the denitrification rate. And a bit is related to temperature as well. The other point I want to make here is that this restoration had no effect on the main channel denitrification rate. So if we compare the reference reach, or the control reach in blue, to the treatment reach where we had the restoration, the relationship between those two didn't change through time. So the effects that we're seeing from this restoration are purely due to the presence of floodplains. So now this figure is showing nitrogen removal in grams per day. So the brown is what's happening in the main channel. That's what would be happening regardless of whether we had put the floodplains in or not. And the green is that additional removal we get from the floodplains. So it varies a bit. On average, it's 3 times higher when we have those floodplains present. Now we're looking at several different sites of varying age. So the blue is the mainstream channel, so that's what's happening sort of in the background. And then the green on top of the blue is the amount of additional nitrogen removal we get with the presence of floodplains. So in this case, we see that Shatto is actually probably less effective than these other sites, where we have up to 24 times the removal. And these are all approximately the same shape. Some of them are a little bigger than others, but the thing that's really driving the nitrogen removal is the denitrification rate on those floodplains. So we wanted to look at that a little bit more closely and see what influences denitrification rate on the floodplains. And the first thing we looked at was organic matter content. So that's necessary for denitrification to occur. And we see that there is a positive relationship. The more organic matter, the higher the denitrification rate in general. Interestingly, we also see a relationship with the age of the floodplains. So the older floodplains tended to have more soil organic matter than the younger floodplains. And we think what's happening is that over time, there's particles settling out on those floodplains, and those particles have a lot of organic matter. We also have vegetation that's dying and decomposing and contributing to that organic matter. This also tells us potentially this is really a self-sustaining system. It's not a sort of restoration where we have an initial positive effect and then it declines through time. It seems to be maintained or maybe even improved through time as those floodplains become more conducive to denitrification. The next thing we looked at was the presence of vegetation. So this graph is a little more complicated. We're looking at denitrification under base flow conditions, so when there's no water, compared to storm flow when there's water on the floodplains. And we have much higher denitrification rates when there's water present. So that's the darker bars, the taller bars. What we also see is that where vegetation is present, that effect is enhanced even further. So vegetation is facilitating that response to inundation. And we haven't fully explored what the mechanism is. It's probably the root exudates from vegetation are providing a source of really late organic carbon for denitrification to occur. So vegetation is important on these floodplains. And just one more thing. I'm not going to show the data, but we looked at a suite of native species versus reed canary grass, which is what colonizes most of these sites. And there really wasn't a difference. So it's merely presence of some vegetation that enhances this. So there's certainly value to getting native species on the landscape for biodiversity and so forth. But in terms of nitrogen removal, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. All right, so thinking about this on a bigger scale, this is looking at annual nitrogen removal. The amount of time that the floodplains are inundated has a strong influence, as you might expect. They're really only, that's when they're making the most contribution to nitrogen removal. So this figure is showing the larger number of days that they're inundated, the more nitrogen removal we get. And some of these sites were inundated for quite a long time. 2011 was a really wet year in this region. One of our sites had water on the floodplains for over a third of the year. So, and they're still stable under this configuration. But it's not just the number of days, it's also the length of time of an individual inundation event. So what we're looking at on the bottom right is what happens over the course of a single event. So we measured denitrification over a 4-day event, and we found that the rates got higher through time. So what's probably happening here is those microbes are responding to that influx of nitrate. They're responding to increasingly anoxic conditions, and they're really ramping up nitrogen removal. So what this means in terms of design is that it's really important to have that floodplain height low enough that they're going to get inundated regularly, because this is really when they're doing the bulk of the work. Not so low that they wash away, of course, but low enough that they can really have an impact. So I want to talk about efficiency a little bit. When I say efficiency, I mean the percent of the nitrate load that's removed by denitrification. So we're looking at this in relationship to annual nitrogen export. What we see is that at these sites that we had lower nitrate concentrations and lower annual nitrogen export, the floodplains can remove 10 to 15% of that load. But when we get out to those really, really nitrate-rich streams that are exporting tremendous amounts of nitrate per year, the efficiency is about 1 to 2%. And what happens is that as more nitrate comes into the stream, we get higher denitrification rates, but they're not able to keep up. So they're removing more, but they're not removing all of the additional nitrate. And so in order to really optimize nitrogen removal, if that's the goals of the restoration, ideally it would be coupled with some other practices upstream or on the fields, so that what's going into the stream is a little lower, less concentrated, and we can get a higher efficiency. Okay, I'm just going to talk briefly about assimilatory nitrogen uptake, and there's sort of a long pathway to get to these numbers, so bear with me. First, we measure photosynthesis and respiration. We have continuous measurements of those processes, and then we convert those measurements into an uptake rate based on stoichiometric ratios. So we have two components here. We have the autotrophic component, so the photosynthesizers, and then we have the heterotrophic component, so that's mostly bacteria that are consuming organic matter. And we found that we had higher photosynthesis rates as a result of floodplain restoration, but it didn't affect the total assimilatory nitrogen uptake because that heterotrophic proportion is so important. So we do enhance photosynthesis, but it doesn't translate to additional nitrogen uptake. So the effects of nitrogen removal we're seeing here are almost entirely due to denitrification. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the effects on chemistry. So this is a graph showing turbidity at several of our sites, and turbidity is in some ways a surrogate for sediment export because so much of that turbidity is sediment particles. The white bars are a reference reach, so the reference reach does not have floodplains, and the black bars are the floodplain sites. And you see at every site except for one, we have a significant decrease in turbidity, so, which was expected. That's probably particles settling out on the floodplains during those flood events. Water chemistry is a little bit more variable. These figures, we are looking at the difference between the floodplain reach and the reference reach. And we see decreased soluble reactive phosphorus at several sites. In some sites, we see a decrease in nitrate concentrations, but we see no effect on total phosphorus or ammonium. So with the soluble reactive phosphorus, it may be getting sorbed to particles, or it may be taken up by biota in the stream. The nitrate is probably denitrification. But we don't see that decrease at every site. And I think what's happening is we just have so much nitrogen in these streams that even though we're getting really tremendous total nitrogen removal, we see minimal effect on the concentration of nitrate. So I think if we were putting these in lower nitrate streams, we would probably see an effect on the concentration. We were a little surprised at the total phosphorus results. We thought that with that reduction in sediment, we would also see total phosphorus gone down, but that's not what we've seen. So we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a new analysis. There's a lot to it, but I'm going to summarize it in one slide. We're looking at cost. What we're really interested in is cost effectiveness. So there's several ways to remove excess nitrogen, including on-field practices, different types of restorations. We wanted to know how this compares in terms of the cost relative to the amount of nitrogen that's removed. And there's a whole lot that goes into this, but I'll just cut right to the important result, which is this column over on the right, the benefit to cost ratio. So in this analysis, the benefit is the savings that we get from not having to treat our drinking water. And then the cost is just the total cost of the practice. And so the ratio of those two tells us if it's cost effective. So a number at 1, the benefits and the cost are equal. Less than 1, it costs more than the benefit, and vice versa. So two-stage ditch is there on the top. We have a cost-benefit ratio greater than 1. So it is a cost-effective practice. And it's fairly comparable to 2 other practices that we chose to look at, restored wetlands and cover crops, which are an on-field practice. So this is a new analysis that I'm really interested in. So if anybody wants to talk about it later, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But the main point is that this is a cost-effective option for nitrogen removal. Okay, just a couple of things we've learned about the design. First of all, I mentioned the more that the floodplains are inundated, the better effects you have on nitrogen removal. So keeping those floodplains low enough that they will get inundated regularly is important. Second of all, it's important to encourage growth of vegetation, both for channel stability, but more importantly, to enhance those nitrogen removal processes. And then finally, ideally, we have, if our goals are reducing nitrogen export, ideally we have this combined with other practices on the landscape. So I just have a little cartoon here showing how it could potentially be in the same landscape as cover crops, so things that are fertilizer management, things that happen on the field, ways that farmers choose to farm. It could also be on the same landscape as a wetland, which really does its best work during base flow conditions where that water can sit there for a long time. And this combination of practices we think would probably achieve the greatest nitrogen removal benefit. Finally, I just want to point out, so the group at Ohio State has done a lot of work with designing. They've got a lot of information on this website about how to design a two-stage ditch. They also have some nice spreadsheet tools that you can use to estimate the nitrogen removal benefit at your site, and also estimate the cost. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a great resource for further information. Okay, and then just to summarize it all, floodplains increase nitrogen removal, and it's almost entirely via denitrification. We can optimize denitrification if we have high soil organic matter on those floodplains, if those floodplains are inundated for longer periods of time, and if we have vegetation established. turbidity and soluble reactive phosphorus were reduced. Those concentrations were reduced. Nitrate concentrations are sometimes reduced. And it also appears to be a cost-effective option relative to all the costs of cleaning up nitrogen in our environments. And I'd like to thank several people for funding and for help in the field and with analysis. And I think there should still be time for questions.
We have 5 minutes for questions, so if anybody has any questions for Sarah.
So do you have a sense if you took a typical Iowa landscape and you did 2-stage ditches for all the first order streams, what percentage of the total flux those streams would be able to address?
That is a great question. We have not done that kind of scaling up.
You know, is it a big number or a small number? Look, people were colleges.
What we've seen at sort of these short reach scales is at our best sites we can get up to 10% of the load removed. So I suppose if you scaled that up, maybe within those stretches you would get 10%. The thing that we've sort of struggled with is if you've got this headwater stream and you're removing all this nitrogen, then what's downstream is getting less, and maybe you get better efficiency downstream. But we haven't done that sort of extensive modeling, and I think that would be a really useful thing to do. But we haven't done that yet. Let's see what.
Therefore, situations where we're looking at these drainage ditches, a lot of them in Iowa are maintained by big associations. And of course, the cost of reduced cost of maintenance might be an incentive. And then to do this, has that been quantified at all? Because there needs to be, they're taking more land out of production, they're widening the area that they have for the ditch.
Yeah.
There needs to be some catch-up.
Yeah, so there was a master's student at the University of Minnesota who did his thesis on that, and he was looking at the cost of the ditch relative to maintenance costs, exactly as you mentioned. And there are definitely scenarios where the cost savings just from not having to dredge out your ditch pay for that land coming out of production. His name is Jeff Kramer. I can maybe talk to you later and get you some more information on that. As far as I know, that's still in thesis form. I don't think it's been.
And that was in what state?
Minnesota. Yeah, and last I heard he defended his thesis, and I don't know if it's gone beyond that, but that analysis has at least been started.
Time for one more.
Okay.
So you keep it low enough so it's inundated frequently. So are you looking at a 1-year storm? How low is going up? So the site that's been inundated the most frequently, it gets inundated about 8 to 12 times per year. We have worked a lot with the Nature Conservancy in Indiana, and they're sort of 2-stage ditch guy. His rule is that if you go out and you look at a ditch and it's started to slump already and started to sort of form floodplains naturally, that height is a good height. So that's sort of the non-mathematical approach to it, because often there's not enough information to use a regional flow curve or something like that. The goal, 8 to 12 times per year seems like a good goal. These are really flashy systems, as opposed to a more natural system where you'd expect only maybe 1 or 2 events on natural floodplains per year. But 8 to 12 seems reasonable for these types of streams, and they seem to still be stable under those conditions. Okay.
Just quick, has anybody looked at the impact of the mercury cycle of this?
No, nobody has. Did you have some hypotheses about that?
It might impact.
Okay. It may. Yeah, we haven't thought about metals at all.
That might be something worth thinking about.
Yeah. Great.
I think that's
All right, thank you.